Hi, my name's Chris Davey, and I want to share with you a new book that I got for Christmas, Proclaim Peace, The Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict, by Patrick Mason and David Pulsipher. Both Mason and Pulsipher work in Utah, respectively at Utah State and then also BYU, Idaho. And I can't recommend this enough, right? There's some excellent commentary in here, but then some really great scriptural connections to what they propose as a restoration theology of peace. Now, for me, one of the reasons why this book was really important, or is really important, is because perhaps many of you who might be concerned about peace and justice and conflict, who are part of that restoration tradition, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or part of the Community of Christ, or others, I've thought a lot about over the last maybe 15 years or so about how to reconcile many of our scriptural accounts of conflict and peace with the gospel of peace that Christ taught. So just to put this in a bit of personal context, I remember probably about 13 years ago now, I was sitting in a Sunday school lesson, I think it was, and we were talking about the Second Coming. And in the Second Coming, generally it's conceived by Christianity that Christ will reign on earth and there will be what is known as millennial peace, or what we might call world peace. And so I'd sat in many lessons like this before and many since. The overwhelming conclusion of the lesson was that peace is something for the future, not for the present, and we can't articulate it based on the past either. And so I found this quite problematic, because Christ gives us, bestows upon us the duty of being peacemakers. And we've heard many conference talks from the prophet in previous years and other general authorities of the church about how we can be peace builders in the present. And so for me, I have been struck with this narrative, or this discourse that we have in restoration theology and in the Church of Jesus Christ particularly, that we have on the one hand the personal peace that we achieve through personal devotion, worship, and then the world peace, or the millennial peace. And that between these two, there's this gulf that we've created where there is no peace in the present, not in our minds, and perhaps lacking in our practice as well. Aside from perhaps the ministering that we do, or the building of perhaps peaceful communities in our families, in our ward communities, there's this real big gap and disconnection between what we see in the future and what we experience or try to seek personally. So that's where this book comes in. Fills that gap neatly and beautifully. We get in here a robust scriptural account, but also theologically speaking, that connects restoration thought to the likes of John Howard Yoder, Walter Wink, and others who have articulated already the connections between the kind of peace that Christ talked about, nonviolence, and other sort of language and ideas of peace building that are so prevalent out there in other communities and other ways of thought. So they do this through building together, through restoration scripture, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and using Old and New Testament to knit together quite a rich tapestry of understandings of conflict, and the necessity of conflict, but then difference between conflict and violence, and the different types of violence. And I was very happy also to see the use of structural, cultural, and direct violence really undergirded their understanding of this social interaction. We see use of the Garden of Eden to help us understand the importance of conflict, and how when we transform conflict, not just try to manage it or try to resolve it, but that when we take those relationships and we move them to the next level, so to speak, that is when we really start to see and build peace. And so that was demonstrated through many different scriptural accounts, but basing that in the Garden of Eden I thought was quite well done. So I won't spoil it because you've got to read it for yourself. Some of the other things in here was the treatment of the prophet Nephi in the Book of Mormon, Nephi, the first prophet in the Book of Mormon, And there were some really great explanations there of some of the traditions and understandings that we have around his use of the sword and his use of the word. And I thought it was quite well done. And there are many other great parts of the book that I won't spoil for you. I'd encourage you again for you to read for yourselves. There was even some discussion of conscientious objection and the church's different stance and proclamations and statements on that phenomena of citizens rejecting their state's call to go to war and to commit violence against their fellow children of God. There are a couple of things in here that pointed towards where we are, not only as a community, but also as a human family, where we're missing and we're lacking. Talking about the transformation of conflicts and the rebuilding and the rehabilitation after conflict, whether it be integrating former child soldiers or other former combatants, or just trying to heal communities. We don't have a wide-scale use of some of the more local tools that are out there. And there's a whole host of great literature that can point us towards that, and a lot of people that dedicate their lives and have dedicated their lives to figuring out that problem. There are a couple of questions that I was left with, though, as I read the book, and one specifically on conscientious objection. Mason and Pulsifer go back to statements via the First Presidency and official stances of the church to try and navigate their way through some of these really difficult issues. Conscientious objection is one of them. And for those of us who live in a country where this is legalized, you're fine in terms of your church standing. But looking back historically, or even in countries where conscientious objection is not a legally protected right, you enter into some difficult grounds in terms of being a member of the church and keeping your covenants, but then in the way in which church leadership conceives of that. So that was a challenge in there, and I missed the well-known refusal of Mormon to not lead his armies because of the prevalence of violence that they had been engaging in and were committed to. That type of violence that they were committed to in the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon. There are a couple other questions that were outstanding for me and connected to conscientious objection is that of civil disobedience. Many of the cases of successful nonviolence that are cited in the book were reliant on civil disobedience and breaking the law and accepting the consequences of doing so. But breaking the law in order to dramatize issues and to push change. So that I would like to have seen more than that, and hopefully there's other conversations going on out there that we can all tap into in terms of, again, being part of that restoration theology or that restoration tradition. There was, as I said earlier, wide discussion of structural, cultural, and direct violence. However, whilst I saw the phrase imperial or cultural imperialism referring to the way in which communities or groups push and pressure conformity into a particular culture, I didn't see a further discussion that I would like to have happen about the cultural imperialism and perhaps even cultural violence that we engage in within our own faith community. So how is it that we can tackle that? And typically speaking, and this isn't true in all parts of the world in terms of church membership, members of the Church of Jesus Christ tend towards socially conservative views, and as we've heard from President Uchtdorf and others, that the church itself is a big tent, so to speak, where all are welcome. However, as many of us might have experienced within the pandemic, those socially conservative views, perhaps even extreme views in some cases, have led to frustration around trying to create a safe environment for people, whether that's around COVID or even to extending to other issues in terms of the inclusion of LGBTQ brothers and sisters within our faith community. So there is some issues there around cultural imperialism and cultural violence that we need further discussion on, we need further thinking around, and a better understanding of how we can not only transform those kinds of conflicting attitudes but work together to understand each other. So, all in all, a fantastic book. I will say that one of the masterful things that's done in here is that, and admittedly, the authors raise lots of principles and describe lots of application of doctrine and extol for us the power of nonviolence, and then even the embedded nature of nonviolence within the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they bring us to this point of application without spelling out for us exactly what should be done, because that not only perhaps is a personal thing, but one that needs to be carried out as part of a wider conversation. So something that I would love to see and would be, again, like many of us, happy to participate in, is how do we apply these issues? How do we develop the kind of growth of knowledge and understanding that's described and advocated for in the book? We don't necessarily need more official degree programs from church-related or church-connected universities, even though those are there, and some perhaps more successful than others. But how do we create a better understanding and practice of this kind of gospel of Jesus Christ that emphasizes and has a place for peace building and nonviolence? Perhaps that's broader discussions online, workshops, even reaching some brothers and sisters who might need that, need to apply that more so in their communities than those of us who live in relative peace and privilege. So lots in here, and it was good to see that there was some learning taken from the community of Christ as well. Our brothers and sisters who have more concretely and more vocally advocated and resolved towards the dedication of renouncing war and proclaiming peace and the practice of nonviolence. So, highly recommend this book, and I'll see you around. Thanks.